Alignment with Rebecca. Today is August 21st, 2020, and I hope everybody is good on this Friday and ready for your day. I really appreciate the fact that there's been some folks who have joined me this week on the discussion of what the hell is communication anyway. And we looked at all the different components of communication. So, communication basically is an ongoing process of negotiation and transaction so that we can make meaning. We're constantly trying to agree to meaning or to make meaning, either with ourselves or with others. And it's, the reason we're defining it is definition is important, right? If you're having a conversation about concepts or ideas that you both haven't agreed to the definition of something, then you're going to have a hard time coming to agreement anyway. So, really finding a way to have mutual meaning making between the two of you, even if it's not like a dictionary definition of something, is super important. And of course, that's why a lot of English teachers out there say, don't use those generalized words. And we're all like, what is a generalized word? Mostly because we have the meaning already situated in our own brains. So it doesn't feel generalized to us, but it may be to somebody else. Words such as, for example, the words we're going to talk about today, sympathy, compassion, and empathy. We all bring different definitions to these terms. In some ways, we use them interchangeably because we feel like they're all basically kind of the same thing, but we're going to sort some of that out today. And I also think like words such as democracy, for example, is really a generalized word because people don't often have a very specific meaning to understand that particular concept. But anyways, so definitions are important, and we need to make sure that as we're going through the process of communication to better align ourselves with other people, that we're taking the time to clarify any definitions of terms that may be confusing, or maybe other people hold different definitions than you. It happens all the time. Communication is messy, it's chaotic, and you shouldn't make it neat because it's not a neat process. You can find a process that works for you while you try to create meaning between you and others or you and yourself. But in general, it's always going to be a messy process. And that's okay because it is a process, communication is. And it also includes things like our spheres of experience, right? So, what do I know in my life? What do you know in your life? What culture I come from? What culture do you come from? What spiritual doctrine do you believe? And so on and so forth. These are our spheres of experience, and they change constantly. They're always changing. And it's also communication is impacted by noise, which makes it really difficult to communicate and certainly very difficult to listen. So there's four kinds of noises. We talked about this already this week. There's the physical noise, such as sounds or computers breaking down or cats howling or whatever it happens to be. Physiological noise, that's the noise that comes to us from our body. So if we're not taking good care of ourselves, if we're not getting good sleep, if we happen to be sick or we have allergies, all these things are going to interrupt our ability to communicate well. We also have semantic noise, which is the noise of language. Somebody speaks a different language, use emojis that you don't happen to understand, shorthand language, so on and so forth. And finally, yesterday we talked about psychological noise, which is the biggest out of the bunch. And this refers to our biases, our assumptions, and all those things we bring with us within our spheres of experience. And they can really get in the way of having good contact, good connections with other people. Finally, to have conscious communication, though, and you notice I'm not just talking about communication, I'm talking about conscious communication. That means we are aware of what we're saying, we are taking the time to observe our thoughts in relation to somebody else's thoughts, for example, And we are being very cognitive about the way we are trying to communicate with all of our nonverbal communication. Again, 70 to almost 90% of our communication acts are nonverbal, and it depends on the scholar you are listening to. So we often need to approach conscious communication through the lens of empathy, compassion, and sympathy. But these words, as I said in the beginning, are really confusing. They're confusing mostly because we use them interchangeably, especially like sympathy and empathy. We use those interchangeably all the time. And most of us don't have a really strong definition of these words. They seem a little ethereal, right? They're hard to grab onto. They're difficult to practice. We have a peripheral idea of how they could function and so on and so forth, but we don't necessarily have a focused idea of how they can function. So let's talk about these three terms, and then what I'm going to say is my suggestion of the best approach when you are communicating. You may disagree with me, and hey, that's cool. We're here to negotiate meaning and to find different ways to align our life so that we're happier human beings. So, sympathy is often referred to as a cognitive understanding of somebody else's feelings. That I can sympathize with you, but I don't necessarily feel with you. So, this means I have an awareness of sorts of how you feel. I can kind of get it. I know, for example, that if you have a great deal of pain, that pain sucks. But if I'm not feeling pain in the moment, I can't feel with you. I can feel for you, kind of, or along with you, but not feel with you. And sympathy is very helpful in the sense that it allows us to stand outside of the moment and to be able to view it from a little bit of a distance, right? So we don't get lost in the emotions, but we can focus on the other person or the situation at hand, and we can be logical about it because we aren't lost in the emotion. The downside of sympathy is that because we aren't feeling it along with the other person, we don't truly understand the suffering of the other person. And why do I say suffering? It could also be joy, for example. So it's not one or the other, but we often think of sympathy at a moment when somebody is suffering. But it is important that we could have sympathy for somebody who is feeling joy as well. And I know that kind of goes against our normal understanding of the idea, but it does fit within the definition itself. But we're not feeling with them, and that's the key. And if we can't feel with somebody, then there's always going to be a space of misunderstanding. There's always that possibility. There's always that possibility anyways. It's more likely that a misunderstanding will occur than an absolute understanding with can occur. But that's just life, right? So empathy, on the other hand, is, a lot of people talk about it as being in somebody else's shoes. If you listen to Michelle Obama's speech at the Democratic National Convention, she defined it very specifically as the ability to stand in somebody else's shoes. Now, I'm not entirely sure we can ever do that. My sister-in-law gave me a great argument on this many, many years ago. And it's an argument you can find in Bright Light's Big City, great book. And it's all written in the second person. So the book itself is saying, you are walking down the street or you are feeling this. But the problem is that my spheres of experience in my life, the things that I've experienced and the way I was raised and all of those different aspects are different than yours. So it's kind of conceited for me to say, hey, I know exactly how you feel, although we say that all the time. We can't know exactly how somebody feels, but we certainly can know why somebody may be crying and how does crying feel. We can totally relate to that. We can totally relate to somebody's joy. We remember joy. We've had joy, right? So we can relate to the broader aspects of emotion, but maybe not the specific, the detailed personal aspects of another person. And that's okay. We don't need that. That's why movies work. That's why plays work and art and all of the humanities in general is because we have a shared understanding of different feelings. When we watch a movie, we can feel with the characters on that screen, and that's why it works. Now, there are some people who would argue against empathy and communication, and for years, actually, I taught that in order to be a good communicator, you had to have empathy. And I'm starting to change that view now because I myself am starting to understand a little bit better about how these ideas function in our everyday life. Again, process and creating meaning, and everything evolves. It will never stay in the same place. So the problem with empathy is it's hard to have empathy for somebody across the globe because you can't hear from them specifically or understand from them specifically what they are going through. All you can have is about the vague kind of notion of what they might be going through. And this is an argument that was given by psychiatrist Paul Bloom in his book Against Empathy from 2016. He suggested that empathy can function best if you are actually face to face, you're in physical proximity, or you have developed a really close relationship with that other person. But once that connection is cut, or you've never had that connection, then you can't have true empathy. You can't stand in the shoes of a person whose experience you don't understand. It's just not possible. It goes back to my sister-in-law and what she was trying to communicate to me well over 10 years ago. And she was right that we can sympathize with those people and we can have compassion, but we can't truly empathize in every single situation. And there's another pitfall, if you will, to empathy. And that is kind of incredible, but ultimately, part of the problem with empathy itself is that if we fall into the emotion that the other person is experiencing, we tend to take over the conversation and we become conversational narcissists. What does that mean? Well, it means like if you are talking to a friend who says, this jerk tried to pick me up in a bar and I told him 5 times, get away. And then I go, oh God, I totally understand how that feels. I remember once, ... You've now turned the conversation to you. You think that you're being helpful, but what has happened is you have gotten so enmeshed in the emotion of an incident like that you have lost sight of the conversation and that the conversation is actually about somebody else and not about you. Now, there's something called mirror neurons, and mirror neurons are the neuron connection in our heads that allow us, if you will, to empathize. Not everybody has it. Some people don't access it. Our biologies are very, very different. But people who tend to access those mirror neurons more regularly than the rest of us, that's somebody who is an empathetic person. They have empathetic feelings. They can immediately feel the emotions of another person. And again, this is partly dangerous. It's dangerous because we can get lost in those emotions and thereby get lost in the point of the conversation in the first place. So what do we do if sympathy keeps us too distant and empathy keeps us too enmeshed? What changes can we make? Well, there's really good arguments for compassion. It is said that compassion allows us not only to feel with the other person, but also give us the distance that sympathy has in order to be able to observe what is going on in some kind of conscious way, in a way we do not get enmeshed in all of the emotions. And then we are better able to navigate. The distance is so much closer to the other person's feelings. We can feel compassion also for people halfway across the globe because we know what it feels like to be in certain situations, and we can bring those ideas to ourselves and then connect it to that other person. So compassion is to feel how the other person feels, but is also an element of sympathy to have that distance. And again, distance isn't bad. It just allows us not to get lost in our own emotional set. And that's really important. So compassion comes from the Latin root of the meaning of to suffer with. But it can also be compassion for somebody else's joy. I think sometimes we limit these ideas to the negative, and we forget to also apply them to the positive. So the question we are left with is, what is the best way to communicate or to enact with other people? And I'm going to argue for compassion. As I said, I used to argue for empathy, and in certain situations, empathy may be called for. But compassion allows us the both worlds of positive, the feeling with somebody else in a world of empathy, but also having a little bit of space away from the situation so that we can cognitively react. So compassion might be the best way to go. So if you communicate with compassion, that means you have the other person's interest at heart, as well as your own, and you are available, truly available, to hold space for other people while experiencing what is going on. So I guess that's what I'm going to give a 2 thumbs up for, is this particular idea. And today's meditation actually will be on the difference between sympathy, empathy, and compassion. And the challenge I have for you today is to really try to think upon those different moments in your life in which you have performed sympathy, empathy, and compassion. Take a deep breath. I want you to get settled. You can sit on a chair, on the floor. You can lay down on a floor, wherever you feel most comfortable, but in a space that won't put you in a place of sleep, if you can avoid it. If you are listening to me in the car or while doing some kind of activity that requires you to have good focus, you might want to go ahead and turn off this particular podcast for the moment and go ahead and take care of what you need to take care of. Now that you're comfortable, I hope, I want you to take a deep breath through your nose and exhale through your mouth with a sigh. Oh, doesn't that feel good? It's good to get a deep breath. We mostly spend most of our day breathing in our chest in a very shallow way. Maybe roll your shoulders back just a little. Get them back, up and back, so that you have good alignment in your back. And now I want you to close your eyes. And take a few minutes just to observe your breath. Don't try to control it. Just stand outside of these bodily processes and take a few minutes to really observe what is going on in your body with your breath. Now, I want you to focus your breath on your heart center. Bring your breath into your heart center and then just exhale. When we bring our breath to our heart center, we're opening ourselves up to grace, to hope, and well-being. Now, I want you to go into your coherent breathing, where we're going to take 5 counts to inhale. We'll hold for 1 or 2 counts, and then we're going to exhale for another 5 counts, and then hold again for another 1 or 2 counts. Let's just breathe for a minute with this even ratio. Now that you're centered, I want you to think about how sympathy functions in your life. You might want to consider a specific incident where you felt sympathy, but also an understanding of detachment. It may be from a news story, maybe something recent, such as somebody dying from COVID, or maybe you saw a homeless person and you felt sympathy for them, but that feeling was a little bit at a distance because there was really no way for you to understand intimately their particular form of suffering. Good. Let's move on to empathy. Our uncanny ability to really feel with another person. Maybe you shared this type of moment with a friend, a parent, a family member. Or maybe you felt it more keenly as you are watching a movie, seeing a character go on their journey. maybe a loved one stubbed their toe or accidentally shut their finger in a car door, and you had that cringe where everything in your body goes, oh, oh. Empathy. Now let's think about compassion, the unity of sympathy with empathy. Imagine a moment in your life where you were able to sustain both of those processes. You felt with them, but you didn't fall into the emotion. You didn't bring it back to you. You had just enough space, just enough observation that you could be present in that moment, holding space for the other person. Or maybe you read a news story and you really felt with the person that was being discussed in the news story. But you had enough space to understand the situation without getting lost in it. Take another final deep breath. Start to winkle your nose, your fingers, your toes. And gently open your eyes back to the present moment. Thank you very much for joining me today, August 21st, 2020, Friday. You've been listening to Alignment with Rebecca, and we'll be back on Tuesday of the next week, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we are impacted by the information we receive in this world, and how we can better detect those moments in which we might be manipulated into thinking or acting in a way that doesn't align with our value systems. I thank you all for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful, peaceful, and blissful weekend. Mahalo and namaste.